Tonight, a ceasefire deal in Lebanon to take effect within hours. Hours after Israeli warplanes bombarded Beirut, Benjamin Netanyahu recommended the agreement to his cabinet. Then Joe Biden made this announcement.
Under the deal reached today, effective at 4 a.m. tomorrow local time, the fighting across the Lebanese-Israeli border will end.
But Israel's Prime Minister made clear his forces are ready to renew their aerial assault. So will this truce hold? Also coming up, policy or bluster, the Trump tariffs troubling governments in China, Canada and Mexico. The president-elect says he wants to impose higher levies because of fentanyl and migrant trafficking. We'll examine his evidence. Plus, why the UK has only issued one fine in 2 years to companies evading Russian sanctions. And inside Hollywood Gate, the CIA base in Afghanistan, where weapons worth billions were left to the Taliban. That's all coming up on The World with me, Yalda Hakim. Good evening. We begin tonight with the ceasefire agreement between Hezbollah and Israel, which is due to come into effect within hours. Hezbollah have backed it, and according to the US, Israel has too. Joe Biden made that announcement in the past few minutes. Failure to agree to a deal would have had deadly repercussions. The Lebanese Health Ministry says more than 3,800 people have been killed by Israeli attacks since last October. In Israel, the Prime Minister's office says 75 people have been killed there by Hezbollah rockets and more than 70,000 others displaced. The violence has stepped up since those pager bombings of just a few months ago. Now both sides want a pause, but that would do nothing to address the destruction in Gaza, where many civilians feel abandoned. Well, we'll cross live to Jerusalem in a moment, but first, let's hear what Joe Biden had to say.
Under the deal reached today, effective at 4 a.m. tomorrow local time, the fighting across the Lebanese-Israeli border will end. This is designed to be a permanent cessation of hostilities. What is left of Hezbollah and other terrorist organizations will not be allowed, I emphasize, will not be allowed to threaten the security of Israel again. Over the next 60 days, the Lebanese army and state security forces will deploy and take control of their own territory once again. Hezbollah terrorist infrastructure in southern Lebanon will not be allowed to be rebuilt. And over the next 60 days, Israel will gradually withdraw its remaining forces. And civilians on both sides will soon be able to safely return to their communities and begin to rebuild their homes, their schools, their farms, their businesses, and their very lives.
That was Joe Biden speaking in the last few minutes. And before the Israeli Prime Minister met with his cabinet, he told reporters his forces would not hesitate to renew their assault if Hezbollah broke the agreement. Have a listen.
Tonight, I will bring to the cabinet for approval an outline for a ceasefire in Lebanon. The duration of the ceasefire depends on what will happen in Lebanon. In full understanding with the United States, we maintain full military freedom of action. If Hezbollah violates the agreement and tries to arm itself, we will attack. If it tries to renew terrorist infrastructure near the border, we will attack.
That was Benjamin Netanyahu. Well, let's go to our Middle East correspondent, Alistair Bunkle, who joins us live from Jerusalem. And Ali, we're listening there to Joe Biden saying that he hopes this is going to be a permanent ceasefire. And then, of course, Benjamin Netanyahu says we'll have no hesitation to renew our assault if we see Hezbollah doing the wrong thing. Just give us a sense of what exactly is in this deal.
Well, first I would say that few people here in Israel share Joe Biden's confidence. Many people, even if they are supportive of a deal, don't think that it will necessarily be long-term. They see this as a return to the UN Resolution 1701 that brought to an end the 2006 Israel-Lebanon war. and in the years afterwards saw Hezbollah regroup, rearm and reposition itself along the Israel-Lebanon border. So there's enormous amount of concern here in Israel that this might be nothing but a temporary truce. In Lebanon, it's very different. They are enormously relieved after some months of heavy bombardment of their cities and villages that there will finally be some calm as of 4 a.m. tomorrow. That is the moment that the truce, the ceasefire, comes into effect. And then over the weeks following that, we would expect to see Hezbollah pull back north of the Litani River in southern Lebanon, and in turn, Israeli forces will then withdraw back into Israeli territory. Now, the void in the south of Lebanon would be filled by the Lebanese armed forces, the official military force of Lebanon, and the or adherence to the ceasefire will be monitored and overseen by them, by UNIFIL, the United Nations peacekeeping force in southern Lebanon, but by the Americans and the French as well. I was quite struck that President Macron released a statement a few minutes ago. The French, in no small part because of their historical relationship with Lebanon, have been a part of these negotiations, but as of only a few days ago, the Israelis didn't want them to be a part of any future enforcement mechanism because there's quite a lot of bad blood between Paris and Israel at the moment over Macron's stance against Israel. But a ceasefire has been agreed. It has been announced by President Biden. It has been confirmed by the Israeli Prime Minister's office.
Ali, thank you so much for that update. And you're looking at live pictures of Beirut at the moment. We've seen Beirut pounded over the course of the last few months. And as Ali was saying there, several thousand people have been killed. More than 1 million people have been displaced in that conflict from the south of the country, from the east of the country, and in and around Beirut as people have been trying to flee Israel's aerial bombardment. And of course, we also saw the leader of Hezbollah, Hassan Nasrallah, killed in Lebanon as well as part of Israel's operation. So there's been a lot of movement. I'm just being told, actually, that there had been further bombardment in Beirut just after Joe Biden spoke. So Joe Biden, as Ali was saying there, incredibly confident that this could lead to some kind of permanent ceasefire, but it just gives you a sense of just how shaky this agreement already is, because I'm just being told, you're looking at the images there of Beirut, that in the last few minutes there's been another series of aerial bombardment in Beirut. I've actually got Ali still standing by. Let's bring him back in. I mean, Ali, we were just speaking in the last few minutes about, you know, how shaky this truce is. And I'm being told, we're looking at live pictures right now of Beirut, and it looks quiet at the moment. But we know the southern suburbs of Beirut have been, you know, just completely battered and flattened in the course of the last few months. And I'm told just in the last few minutes, the aerial bombardment has continued.
Well, there's been major airstrikes in Beirut all day. I think it was about 20 in the space of 2 minutes earlier on this afternoon in the southern suburbs. And actually, only a couple of minutes ago, we saw 2 fighter jets flying over us in Jerusalem heading north. Obviously, we don't know what they were doing and what their mission was. But it's no surprise, and both sides will be expecting that in these next few hours, before the ceasefire comes into force at 4 a.m., both sides will be using those final minutes and hours to hit each other. And we've seen the Israelis doing that in Beirut, also in Tyre, Lebanese city on the coast further south from Beirut earlier on today. Hezbollah have been firing missiles and drones into Israel. I think about 10 minutes ago, there was quite a major attack south of Haifa. So, yeah, the coming hours I expect to be quite intense before that ceasefire comes into force. So it would be no surprise to me if there are further strikes in Beirut and other parts of Lebanon overnight, and also if Hezbollah decide to fire more rockets into Israel.
Yeah, I mean, we're currently looking at those live shots of Beirut, Ali, and we can see some smoke in the background. This has been the situation for the Lebanese right across the country over the course of the last few months. You know, we'll just remind our audience that we saw those attacks on Hezbollah fighters, pages exploding, walkie-talkies exploding, then the top sort of leadership of Hezbollah being decapitated, then Hassan Nasrallah himself being assassinated. So this has been a very difficult few months for the Lebanese. More than 1 million people have been displaced. Almost 4,000 people have been killed. As you say, the Lebanese incredibly relieved at this point that there has been some kind of agreement. But as you say, Ali, I mean, Israel is going to try and launch a few more strikes, aren't they? It's going to be a difficult night for the Lebanese. We don't know exactly which hour this ceasefire will come into effect. We're told within the next few hours. But no doubt they're going to want to continue to hit targets, you know, as they head towards this already very shaky ceasefire.
Well, 4 a.m. local time was the time given by President Biden for when the ceasefire will come into effect. So we're talking, what, just under 5 hours from now. The fact that Israel has still got targets to hit in Lebanon shows that Hezbollah are far from being defeated. They have been severely pushed back. I mean, as you say, their leadership has been eliminated one by one in some quite extraordinary strikes, starting with the pager attacks and then a series of targeted airstrikes over recent months. But those airstrikes might have taken out senior Hezbollah leadership, but they've also destroyed villages, towns, neighborhoods in Beirut and elsewhere, Baalbek, the Bekaa Valley, for example. I mean, the rebuilding process in Lebanon will take many years, particularly with an economy on its knees anyway, and a government in flux. But, you know, from the Israeli side as well, people living on the northern border here, 60 or 70,000, the numbers aren't quite exact, but have had to leave their homes and a lot of them been living in hotel rooms for the last 14 months. And if you spend time either in southern Lebanon or northern Israel, as I have done, you know, right along the border, houses are destroyed by missile fire, by rocket fire. There's been an enormous amount of damage. Now, the Israelis have, you know, there's been a number of Israelis killed, civilians and soldiers. Only today, actually, an IDF soldier was severely wounded on a drone attack in an Israeli base. But the Lebanese toll is far greater. And about 1.2 million Lebanese are displaced, thought to be displaced. Around 300,000 have fled over the border into Syria. And so it has taken an enormous toll on Lebanon. I think the figures of those displaced are far greater even than in 2006. So, of course, they will be looking upon this with great relief. But everybody is thinking whether or not this ceasefire can survive more than a matter of weeks or months.
Yeah, Ali, as you say, we'll be watching developments very closely. You're looking at live pictures right now of Beirut, where we understand there have been continued aerial bombardment there as we move towards what is going to be quite a shaky ceasefire, with Benjamin Netanyahu already saying that they will renew their aerial bombardment over Lebanon if Hezbollah attempts to break that ceasefire deal. We will watch developments very closely. For now, Ali, thank you. Now, let's talk tariffs. China, Canada and Mexico today hit back at Donald Trump's plan to impose higher levies on trade as economists warned of a possible impact on American consumers. The president-elect said he would sign executive orders on his first day in the White House. Well, let's just have a look. He threatened to target goods from Canada, China and Mexico, America's three biggest suppliers. He said he'd increase existing tariffs on Chinese goods by 10% and create a 25% tax on imports from Canada and Mexico. Economists say that could raise prices for American customers on petrol, cars and electronics like phones and TVs. Our US correspondent James Matthews reports.
They're making preparations for the inauguration, for Donald Trump 2.0 and how that will look. We already got the idea.
To me, the most beautiful word in the dictionary is tariff, and it's my favorite word.
A tariff is a charge placed on a country's imports, like cars. Donald Trump has said that for Canada and Mexico, tariffs on goods will increase by 25% on day one of his presidency. China will face an increase of 10%. The return to power is a return to policy by post on social media. Trump wrote, "This tariff will remain in effect until such time as drugs, in particular fentanyl, and all illegal aliens stop this invasion of our country."
Here, just hang out right here real quick.
It is political problem solving outsourced. It would have a far-reaching impact economically. It would violate a North American trade deal that Trump signed himself during his first term. The countries targeted are America's top 3 suppliers of goods.
Trump believes in his heart that the foreigners pay the tariff. And that's just not true. It gets passed on to consumers. It would be inflationary here. It would be disruptive to the international system. The United States would be in violation of, more rules than I can count. I don't see anything positive coming out of it if he actually does it.
The Trump plan hasn't been well received in those countries targeted, even if the reaction has been measured. Mexico's president has said the tariffs would cause inflation and job losses in both countries. Canada's Prime Minister Justin Trudeau spoke to Trump on the phone and spoke of a relationship that needs work.
It was a good call. This is something that we can do, laying out the facts, moving forward in constructive ways. This is a relationship that we know takes a certain amount of working on, and that's what we'll do.
This was Donald Trump in Mar-a-Lago, being gifted the armour of a captain who survived an explosion in Afghanistan. Time off between talk of tariffs. It may be negotiation by Donald Trump, a tactic to achieve what he wants politically, whatever the diplomatic unease and economic uncertainty. It wouldn't be the first time. James Matthews, Sky News in Washington.
And we'll be speaking to James in a moment. But joining us now is Flavio Volpe, the head of Canada's Automotive Parts Manufacturers Association. Thank you so much, Flavio, for joining us here on the programme. First of all, your reaction to what you're hearing from Donald Trump, because we knew that tariffs were sort of top of his agenda. He sort of campaigned around it the entire time as well.
Yes, throughout the campaign and here in Canada, we had a reasonable expectation that he was going to win. And he talked about a universal tariff, 10 to 20% for Canada and for Mexico, and I guess for all of his other trading allies around the world. The only surprise was the timing. Yesterday, November 25th, a full 2 months before he's inaugurated, he did what he frequently does, is disrupt conversation and disrupt trade confidence by using social media. He's good at it, but I think we've been trying to tell everybody today to be patient. We've seen these tactics before. The actual negotiations are based in math and science. And like your piece said, Canada is one of the biggest trading partners of the United States. We make a lot of things, including the cars and the companies I represent, together.
So are you saying that basically this is sort of a tactic by Donald Trump, that we should really be watching what he does rather than what he says?
You know, if this was 2016, I think we all might be getting ready on that plunge down the roller coaster. But we understand this is how he inserts tension into trade negotiations. What he did specifically here for Canadian audiences is he conflated Mexico issues, their southern border issues, security issues with Canada. We don't have the same issues here, but we've been having a debate the last couple of weeks in this country and in Mexico City on whether we have a special relationship with Donald Trump and the United States. Is it bilateral, or is it because we're in the USMCA trilateral? I think he answered that question last night by saying, hey, I'll dictate the terms on how we speak to each other.
I guess the question to you then is, how does this affect your industry? If, for example, he does impose the sort of tariffs that he's looking at rather than just threaten?
Well, different from the U.S. tariffs on Chinese imports. In Canada, half of the 2 million cars we make a year are made by American brands. Half of the parts that go into all of the cars that we make here come from U.S. parts suppliers, and about 55% of the raw materials are American. So like we successfully negotiated in the first Trump term, the American interest in automotive is the Canadian interest. There is no way to undo the omelet and say here's the yolk and here's the whites. We work very well together. Now, in the second term, China has gone from an academic threat to a real one. And if the U.S. under Trump is really going to pivot to trying to regain the balance of power and push off the encroaching Chinese hegemony, then they need partners who are willing to work with them and have the natural resources that they lack. Critical minerals for batteries, aluminum for defense purposes, as well as automotive, oil and gas, fresh water. We have that, and we've been an eager partner for the last 150 years. I think not reacting to social media posts, but watching for post-inauguration executive orders or congressional instruments and then responding to those.
Well, Flavio, as you say, we'll have to wait and see how this all evolves. Still a few weeks left until President-elect Donald Trump is inaugurated. And although he is imposing a lot of, putting out there a lot of what he's thinking, we'll have to see how it all unfolds. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So Donald Trump says this is partly about drugs. So how does fentanyl get trafficked into the United States? Well, let's have a look. The production and distribution chain for fentanyl involves countries on both sides of the Pacific Ocean. China is the main source of the chemical precursors used by criminals in North America to produce the drug. Chemical manufacturers in China ship fentanyl in a powder form to Canada, the United States, and Mexico via mail services. The powder is then processed and mixed in with other illegal drugs to increase its potency. Criminals in Mexico and Canada then smuggle those products across the border into the United States, where it's sold on the streets. Well, our US correspondent James Matthews has been following the story from Washington. James, we just heard there from our guest and also in your piece the way that Donald Trump has sort of conflated the issue of drugs and migration. He says this is about drugs. Just give us a sense of what's happening.
Yeah, drugs is a huge problem in the United States. I mean, fentanyl in particular, Yalda, we've been talking a lot about it. It kills 100 people a day in the States, and it has its roots in the use of opioids. And as opioids became more difficult to access on prescription legally, that's when illicit fentanyl began to be manufactured using chemicals smuggled in from the likes of China and from Mexico. That illicit fentanyl is powerful, extremely powerful, 100 times more powerful than morphine. So it's easy to see why it is so dangerous and why it is so damaging to the health of this nation. I mean, we've been doing a lot of filming and investigation into the fentanyl crisis, and you go into communities around the United States and they are afflicted across the whole spectrum of society. One use can kill one individual. So there are communities across this country in the grip of a fentanyl crisis. It is one of the most pressing matters in the inbox of Donald Trump. And I think that plays into why he is talking about it today and tying it in to the tariffs and pointing the finger at other countries. It is perhaps very likely a point of negotiation for Donald Trump, almost outsourcing a political priority to other countries to sort before he sets foot back into the White House. A huge issue, a huge problem, and a huge challenge for Trump when he resumes the presidency.
Yeah, I mean, as you say, throughout his campaign, he talked about this being a priority for him. The other thing that is top of his in tray, of course, as we've heard throughout his campaign, was and is immigration.
Indeed. It was immigration that won him the election. That was one of the top election campaigning priorities on which the people voted and supported him. And you have to look at the figures, Yalda, I suppose, to give you an idea of the scale of the challenge and the scale of the problem. Let me read a couple of figures to you. Between October 2023 and September 2024, there were 198,929 migrant encounters at the US-Canada border. In terms of the US-Mexico border, there were 2,135,005 migrant encounters there between October 2023 and September 2024. It's a huge issue in this country. It's a huge issue for Trump. It is a huge issue in the minds of the voters who have swept him into power. And there is an urgent priority for him to be seen to get to grips with it. During his first term in office, it's something that he never quite did. As much as he trumpeted the building of the wall and its effectiveness, you go to the US-Mexico border and there are long strips, several miles long, of a wall that was not built. It was a failure in that regard for Donald Trump in his first term inside the White House. It has been a failure for Joe Biden during his term, and there is much pressure on Trump to deliver and to deliver quickly on it.
Matthew, thank you. James, rather, not Matthew. James, thank you so much. Well, from tariffs to sanctions, UK's financial sanctions watchdog has admitted to only issuing a single fine for the evasion of sanctions imposed on Russia. Only one £15,000 fine has been levied, according to the Treasury's crime chief. That's despite evidence uncovered by Sky News over several months that goods such as luxury cars and drone equipment are still making it to Russia. Well, earlier, I spoke to our economics and data editor, Ed Conway, who explained how countries and companies are skirting the sanctions. Have a look.
So it's a bit of an update on where we are. You'll probably remember we've had these charts and showed you them, for months and months and months. This is showing you the flows of trade from the UK to Russia, specifically in what are known as dual-use items. This is the kind of stuff, parts, components that go into weapons that we know have been found on the battlefield in Ukraine. So it's the stuff we really shouldn't be sending to Russia. And you can see, look at the red line there. It stops at the moment of the Russian invasion. But then look what happens next. So countries like, Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan, the Caucasus nations, what you see here is a big increase in the flows of these sanctioned items to those Caucasus nations at that point. So And the update here is, if you look at the line on the far right-hand side, that's just a few months ago. This is still happening, so the goods are flowing there. And another update, remember when we talked about this before, we were kind of trying to dissect what are the things we're still sending that are probably ending up in Russia? And the answer is, and it's, I'm afraid, quite depressing, it's drone parts, it's telephone switching equipment, data processing, navigational aids. It's precisely the kinds of things that we shouldn't be sending, obviously, and yet we know that it is going close to Russia, and we know that it's ending up on the battlefield as well.
And Ed, I guess, we're coming up to almost 3 years of this war raging on, and these sanctions have been imposed. The question then is, who is being held accountable for allowing all of these things to get into Russia?
I mean, it's the key question, isn't it? Because what happens is, the goods are effectively kind of laundered. And you get a sense of that if you kind of look at the map. I mean, theoretically, if you're in the UK and you're making a certain component, or indeed a car or something, you know that it shouldn't be going to Russia over there in the red. And you know that it shouldn't be going indirectly to Russia, OK? So you shouldn't really be sending it abroad, and HMRC shouldn't be approving that. But in practice, what happens is a lot of stuff, and you saw it in the charts there, a lot more stuff than was previously, is going to places like Azerbaijan, to Georgia, to Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, all of these areas just on the borders of Russia. And then it gets shuffled around. And this is the tricky thing. It doesn't necessarily go straight from Azerbaijan or indeed Georgia into Russia. It might go somewhere else. It might go across into somewhere like Armenia. It might go to Kyrgyzstan. It might go to Kazakhstan. It might even supposedly go through Russia to Kazakhstan, but not actually end up there. But what we do know from having gone to Georgia and looked at the border is British items are going across the border even now. And that's the problem is, do you clamp down and say, well, we're going to impose sanctions on you? Well, then you're into this kind of soft power issue of, like, we want to, you know, to have decent diplomatic relations with places like Azerbaijan and Georgia and Kazakhstan, lots of important minerals there in the future. So it's not just this war. But the upshot of all of it is the stuff is still going in there and Russia's doing all right.
And so, you know, a lot of these countries bypassing the sanctions, sending things to Russia. And of course, on the battlefield, Russia is increasingly doing very well. I guess looking forward, and we keep talking about Donald Trump wanting to negotiate a deal, bring both sides to the negotiating table. Where does this sort of leave things now for Ukraine, for Russia?
Yeah, I mean, this, I think, is part of the story of why Russia has been able to have that strength on the battlefield. It's because it's been able to make lots of money from selling oil and gas into, you know, Europe and other parts of the world, and that often gets laundered along the way as well. It's been able to buy the stuff it needs to wage war. And as a result, the economy in Russia is not doing all that badly. I mean, it's hard to be sure of the numbers, but it's not doing that badly. And as you say, on the battlefield, we know it's been doing well. And all of this feeds into that question of, if and when it comes to that settlement, where are those borders drawn? How much of this, you know, how does this go for Russia? Well, this is part of the explanation of how they've managed to kind of retain certain amounts of territory and certain amounts of strength, and why it's been an uphill battle for Ukraine. But there's a great irony. We have been supporting Ukraine, trying to get money and weaponry to Ukraine. At the same time, some of our equipment has been going via the Caucasus nations and Central Asia into Russia at the same time. So it is a murky and slightly depressing tale, and sadly, it's not going very well.
No, not at all. Ed, thank you so much for all of your reporting on this. So that was our Ed Conway there. Let's speak now to Elin Suleymanov, Azerbaijan's ambassador to the UK, who joins me here in the studio. Thank you so much. You were seeing a part of our report there, but of course this is part of an ongoing sort of coverage and investigation that we've been doing into how sanctions are being evaded in certain places. Azerbaijan is a distributor of some of these vehicles. Is that correct?
Azerbaijan imports some of the vehicles from UK. Azerbaijan is a very popular destination for UK vehicles. In fact, British cars are very popular in Azerbaijan. If you go in Azerbaijan, you would see a lot of British cars being driven around. People just like them. I, for instance, own one British car in Azerbaijan. So this is actually a very good market for British cars. And the British car manufacturing industry groups have always been very clear that things go to Azerbaijan. So we're buying them. We don't distribute them, but some of the dealerships are based in Azerbaijan, yes.
And then they go to places like Georgia, Armenia.
Georgians sometimes buy them, some other countries also to buy them. But very important, I want to say it very clearly, not a single car, to my knowledge, has been exported from Azerbaijan to Russia. We have a land border, but none of them has been.
And I guess that isn't the question here. The question, I guess, here is that, you know, cars are sold on to Georgia, and then there is an understanding that Georgia is then sending over the cars into Russia. I mean, Ed Conway has stood on the border and seen these cars leave Georgia into Russia.
I don't know. Some Georgian individual may buy an individual car in Azerbaijan from a dealership, or may buy from other places. I don't know. Georgians actually import a lot of cars because they have a port imported. They have also dealerships and distributorships. So I don't know. I don't necessarily. This is a bit of a speculative connection to make it. If you know, you could buy a car in Azerbaijan and then you see a car going from Georgia. I mean, I don't know if that's connected to each other. But I have to say something that our Western partners publish quite number of reports on sanction evasions. None of them Azerbaijan figures, unlike others. So for instance, our neighbor Armenia, for that matter, has increased since 2022 to 2024 its trade over with Russia about sevenfold, for 2.5 billion to 15 billion this year, and that was acknowledged. So, I mean,
the finger of blame right now is not necessarily on Azerbaijan, and the accusation is not that Azerbaijan is selling these vehicles onto Russia. However, countries and companies are evading sanctions. That is
some may, but we never do that. Azerbaijan is very responsible, and there have never been any concern about these things happening in Azerbaijan. But also, please understand, when people speak about the rise in exports into Azerbaijan and Azerbaijan importing British cars, these are popular cars. If you go in Azerbaijan, many people drive cars around. If the goal is not to sell British cars to Azerbaijan, that's a different issue.
It's not. The question is not to not sell the cars to Azerbaijan. It's where they end up. And the fact is that there are sanctions imposed on Russia, and we know that countries like Georgia and Armenia, these vehicles are ending up, and other supplies are ending up in Russia, and they are evading these sanctions.
They may, but I am not aware of Azerbaijani cars bought in Azerbaijan. So, I mean,
do you think it's Azerbaijan's responsibility, though, to know when these cars are distributed, where they end up?
Not necessarily. I mean, especially since our border, we have a land border with Russia. It's one of the longest borders. None of this cars is being exported from Azerbaijan. I mean, if individual Georgians want to buy a car and use it in Georgia, I mean, what kind of supervisory mechanism we have? I mean,
this is not about individuals, it's about companies, and then they're on-selling them into Russia.
I do not believe this is the case with the imports into Azerbaijan. That has not been our experience.
Have the UK government at all expressed concern to Azerbaijan officials at all about this, saying that they think that these sanctions are being evaded, cars that are being, imported into Azerbaijan could end up in Georgia, could end up in Armenia, and then end up inside Russia?
UK officials has repeatedly raised their concerns with different countries about sanction evasions, including for Armenia. I told you there's a 7-fold increase in trade. Obviously, that's not an economic miracle. They're my neighbors. I know how it works. Azerbaijan has never been a subject of concern by UK officials or US officials or anybody else in terms of sanctions. Azerbaijan is a very responsible member of the international community. We just don't do that. And there might be some individual car going unconnected to Azerbaijan. I mean, Georgia also imports a lot of cars outside Azerbaijan. I think there is a bit of a almost obsessive speculation trying to connect somehow Azerbaijan into this.
I don't think it's about connecting Azerbaijan, but it's following the trail and understanding how these sanctions, heavy sanctions that have been imposed on Russia, continue to be evaded. And Russia's economy, frankly, despite the invasion of Ukraine, continues to do quite well. And then by default, they're feeding their war machine, and it's helping them in the battlefield.
In all fairness, I don't think buying a British car would anyhow feed the war machine.
I mean, it is part of the sanctions program,
I know, but
it's not just about individual cars, because we've seen graphs that Ed Conway was just showing, that drones, parts of, aircraft, for example, it's not just vehicles. Vehicles are the easiest, I guess, for us as journalists to trace.
And I think if that is a concern, that should be looked into, investigated. I mean, and that's why, once again, I will remind you once again, and I'm sorry that I'm also perhaps obsessive on this issue, is that our neighbor Armenia has increased 8-fold its trade over with.
But you don't think it's Azerbaijan's responsibility to track where the cars end up?
Which cars?
The British cars that get sold on to you, then,
most British cars which are imported in Azerbaijan actually stay in Azerbaijan, and people happily drive them. Once again, they're very popular. If you go to Azerbaijan, you would see how, I mean, we have a Bentley dealership which people actually like, and a Range Rover is one of the most popular cars in Azerbaijan.
Ambassador, I want to briefly ask you about COP. Did you feel that it was obviously hosted by your nation? Did you feel it was a success, was a failure? I mean, there was mixed reviews around it.
It was a great success, and tell you why. Because for the first time in 9 years, since Paris, there was finally an agreement on finance. This is the most difficult and the most sensitive issue in climate agenda.
I mean, your president has described oil as a gift from God. Do you think that's helpful?
Yes, when President Aliyev described every resource we have as a gift of God. Indeed, and that's why, for instance, wind, and he said that, by the way, wind and sun are also gifts of God, and we're working on this. We're trying to invest in this, and UK is helping us to do that. And just listen to Keir Starmer, listen to Ed Miliband, and to President Biden, who just described it as a historic breakthrough in Azerbaijan. What hasn't happened for 9 years happened in Azerbaijan because Azerbaijani presidency of COP pushed for the most important decision for the climate vulnerable nations. So, of course, that's not enough. If you look at the op-ed by COP president, Mr. Mukhtar Babayev, he would tell you how much some nations undermined the progress towards this goal. But under current circumstances, I would fully agree with Secretary Miliband. This is practically the best decision which could be made.
Ambassador, we're really grateful for your time. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Now let's just go to our top story, that ceasefire that was agreed between Israel and Lebanon. The British Prime Minister has released a statement. Let's just have a look. He says today's long overdue ceasefire between Israel and Lebanese Hezbollah will provide some measure of relief to the civilian populations of Lebanon and northern Israel, who have suffered unimaginable consequences during the last few months of devastating conflict and bloodshed. Now, this deal must be turned into a lasting political solution in Lebanon based on Security Council Resolution 1701 that will allow civilians to return permanently to their homes and for communities on both sides of the border to rebuild. The UK and its allies will continue to be at the forefront of efforts to break the ongoing cycle of violence in pursuit of a long-term, sustainable peace in the Middle East. We must see immediate progress towards a ceasefire deal in Gaza, the release of all hostages, and the removal of restrictions on desperately needed humanitarian aid. And in the past few minutes, Israel has issued evacuation warnings for suburbs in southern Beirut hours before the truce takes effect. And as Ali Bunkle was saying a little bit earlier, we're expecting the ceasefire to come into effect at 4 a.m. local time, so about 4.5 hours from now. And as we know, there have been continued aerial bombardment in Beirut, but you're looking at live pictures right now of the port there in Beirut. This is The World with me, Yalda Hakim. Next up, we'll be live in Moscow after Russia expels a British diplomat.
secret hospital hidden in the Myanmar jungle, treating the victims of this bloody war.
This is Myanmar today. Its military rulers don't want the world to see, but we have.
I fight for my own future. I fight for my generation's future.
This is an actual crime.
They don't care for that.
Myanmar army is only a couple of kilometers away. So this is a major humanitarian disaster.
Welcome back. Relations between Moscow and London have deteriorated further tonight as Russia announced it has banned a number of British cabinet ministers from entering the country after expelling a British diplomat over spying claims. The UK has responded saying it's not the first time Moscow has made what it calls malicious and baseless claims against staff. Well, our Moscow correspondent, Ivor Bennett, joins us now. Ivor, a lot of developments over the last few hours. Just bring us up to date.
Yeah, we've had an expulsion, an ambassadorial summoning and then multiple blacklistings. It has been a very busy day for British interests here in Russia. First of all, with the blacklistings, 30 British citizens, mostly members of the cabinet, have been banned from entering Russia for what Moscow calls anti-Russian activities. They include the Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, the Deputy PM, Angela Rayner. It's not explicitly linked to the permission granted by Britain for Ukraine to fire British missiles into Russian territory, but it's hard not to see as the two being related, because it's happened only a week after that move, a move that sparked fury in the Kremlin, with Russia accusing the UK of being directly involved in the conflict, given that permission on long-range missiles. So I think this is part of the backlash, and I think that this diplomatic expulsion is also linked to that, along with the very public summoning of Britain's ambassador to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs today. When he arrived at the ministry, Nigel Casey, the ambassador, was greeted by Russian TV crews and cameras, an attempt by Russia to make the news of the diplomatic expulsion as public as possible. The diplomat in question was accused of spying and of providing false information when he entered the country. No evidence was given to back that up. This is images of the ambassador arriving at the ministry, by the way. But the Foreign Office, the UK Foreign Office, has called these allegations baseless and malicious. Why did they go so public on it, though? I think it's part of an attempt, a continued attempt by Russia, to paint Britain and Ukraine's other allies as the enemy, out to destroy Russia. We heard a lot of that kind of language last week around the permission on long-range missiles. This feels like Moscow doubling down on that, and an attempt to reinforce that narrative we hear time and again here, that Russia is the innocent party, apparently, and that NATO countries like Britain are the aggressors.
Ivor, thank you so much for bringing us up to date there. So, what happened in the days after the Afghan capital fell to the Taliban? Well, one filmmaker was granted extraordinary access to what was once an alleged CIA base in the country. We'll speak to Ibrahim Nashat in a moment, but let's just have a look at a clip from his documentary, Hollywood Gate.
With only my camera, I came to see in whose hands this country was left.
Well, I've got Ibrahim here with me in the studio. Thank you so much for joining us here on the programme. First of all, just talk us through Hollywood Gate, what it is, what you saw in this base, and sort of what you discovered in those early days after the fall.
So officially and on paper, this base doesn't exist at all. It does exist. In reality, it's inside Kabul Air Base, in the military side, and it was a CIA base, but the CIA hasn't confirmed that, but it's being called by everybody a CIA base. And the door of that base has the word Hollywood Gate on it. And there were a lot of things left behind inside that base, and it was being used as the center of fixing weaponry that was left behind. So Taliban have used that base to fix weapons, fix airplanes, and I followed the Taliban for 1 year as they discovered the weapons left behind inside this base and outside it, tried to fix these weapons and their plans, what they plan to do with these weapons.
It's quite extraordinary, actually, because for 20 years we had heard about these black sites, CIA black sites, these weapons bases, but of course it was all closed off to the outside world. Suddenly the Taliban take over, and then someone like you gets full access to a place and places that frankly didn't exist for 20 years.
It's quite bizarre considering the fact that the Taliban today are banning even themselves from being filmed. They have applied these rules that there's no more filming for themselves inside like Takhar and their other sides, and it's coming to Kabul definitely. And it becomes very rare to see such images of the base that you don't see it from the American side, and it's the base that Taliban are taking over it, and the clash of cultures of the Taliban taking over this base where you think they cannot do anything, but they could do things.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I remember those early images of the Taliban suddenly discovering this state-of-the-art billions of dollars worth of equipment that the Americans, frankly, turned lights out in a lot of these bases, left behind, frankly, to the enemy.
And unfortunately, the dealing with that problem has been dealt with as if it's a partisan problem between the two parties that were running for presidency, and we haven't heard any of them talking about how can, in the US or outside the US, from the NATO countries, how we haven't heard anyone talking about Afghanistan and trying to find a solution. And I hope that the movie would try to bring the word again to look again towards Afghanistan and try to find a solution for the situation that the people in Afghanistan are facing, especially women today. That women cannot go out and walk in the park. Her voice has become forbidden, and they cannot have any education. And the situation is just getting worse every single day.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, for so many of the women and girls in Afghanistan, girls can't go to school, women can't do something as basic as taking their children to a local park, universities are shut in the faces of women. And yet the Taliban, even in sort of the negotiations around 2019, when they were negotiating with the Americans, the so-called famous Doha deal, they tried to paint themselves as the good Taliban, the new Taliban, the Taliban 2.0, that they would be different from the Taliban of the 90s, when in fact we're seeing a lot of their policies are quite similar. They just know how to package it better.
I think the Taliban did not only inherit from the US, the weapons were left behind, but what they inherited the most was the propaganda tools that they are using. They understand politics, they are playing politics, and they are using all of the propaganda tools possible. They try to use this movie as a tool of propaganda, Hollywood Gate as a tool of propaganda for themselves. We've made a movie about propaganda to expose that. And I hope that the world would realize that the forever war mentality that was applied in Afghanistan in the first place was a mistake, and we had to find a solution for the Afghans. And hopefully this solution would not be to conduct another war, because the situation is getting every day worse and worse.
Tell me how they used your film as a propaganda tool.
They tried in the beginning, as you know, from the early days when Taliban took over power, they were allowing a lot of journalists in because the journalists were bringing out footage about them that are showing them in a positive manner. We're showing them as Taliban 2.0, as they were claiming in the beginning. And this was the early time when they have given me the access, and their hopes was that this film would be one of those other reports that composed about them. But I stayed for a full year filming that. And by the time they started to discover that, oh, this is not what we're expecting, this guy is staying here longer than we wanted him to be staying, and they tried to get rid of me. With a lot of persistence from our side, we were able to continue shooting. And the outcome of the movie, that rather than making the propaganda they wanted, we made a movie that is about the propaganda, so you can understand their trials and what they try to propagate on you.
They've also developed quite slick and sophisticated videos and, tools themselves. As you say, they've sort of picked up a lot over the course of the last 20 years. And certainly from filmmakers even like yourself, they probably learn a lot of tactics quite quickly.
They are learning a lot of tactics, and they learned that from Hollywood, the Hollywood propaganda that was imposed on them for 20 years, showing them as only the enemy, as that there's only enemy that does only bad things. They don't sleep, they don't drink, they don't do anything except killing, and they are using the same deal now on the Afghans, showing the rest of the world, using the same propaganda tools that everyone else is an infidel, everyone else is bad, and we're the only good people on earth. And it's the same propaganda tool that makes people split and not come together.
When you went into Hollywood Gate, for example, and just traveling around the country, what was their reaction to what they were discovering? Because you were seeing a lot of these places for the first time through their eyes.
I think they were surprised they found those things, and I was extremely surprised they are going to be able to do anything with that. I never took it serious because of my pre-assumptions that the Taliban, if they cannot do simple math, they cannot fix anything. So in my head, they cannot fix any of these things. And when they were saying we're fixing that, I couldn't believe it. But the process of spending the whole year with them showed completely a different story.
So what did you find and discover from that? Because actually, you know, you see these propaganda videos that come out of Afghanistan of them operating, American helicopters, for example, or some of their equipment. And you think, how did they manage to put some of this equipment back together?
It's a question we're asking ourselves of how did they manage to do that and why were these things left behind?
So that was the big question.
It's the big question of the
takeaway from your film is why was all of this equipment left and they didn't sort of take it with them as on their way out?
Yeah, and they didn't destroy it properly. They have just destroyed it in a way that is possible to be fixable by the Taliban. And I think there's a bit of underestimation of their culture, considering the fact that there's a huge difference between sophistication and simplicity, and they have doomed Taliban to be simple, so they are not able to do any sophisticated things, yet they were able to fix these weapons. And if you want to understand what's behind and what's in the heads of the Taliban, then you got to watch this film.
Ibrahim, well, great film. Thank you very much for joining us here on the programme. Well, that's it for the programme tonight. That ceasefire between Israel and Lebanon comes into effect in just over 6 hours' time. We'll be watching all of the developments closely. For now, good night. Day of this conflict.
They keep telling us that they want aid.
And this is what's left of it.
Why only in America? People want their country to work.
Just want a job in a normal life.
Why are these homes empty?
I want you to be honest with people.
That has happened within minutes.
Sky News, the full story first. Free wherever you get your news.
We arrive. A secret hospital hidden in the Myanmar jungle, treating the victims of this bloody war.
This is Myanmar today. Its military rulers don't want the world to see, but we have.
I fight for my own future. I fight for my generation's future.
This is an actual crime.
They don't care for that.
Myanmar army is only a couple of kilometers away. So this is a major humanitarian disaster.